Hello, I'm Hunter Jones, the Climate and Health Project Manager within NOAA's Climate Program Office. I'm pleased to be facilitating this panel on advancing urban heat resilience. The session will explore the current state and innovations in planning, design, and governance for urban heat, including a survey of U.S. planners and review of municipal plans. Attendees will gain insight into the challenges and opportunities in research and practice to advance urban heat resilience. Our panel today is composed of experts in urban planning, geography, and sustainability. We will hear from Dr. Kelly Turner, Assistant Professor in Urban Planning from the University of California, Los Angeles, Dr. Sarah Miro, Assistant Professor in Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University, and Dr. Ladd Keith, Assistant Professor in Planning and Sustainable Built Environments from University of Arizona. I hope our attendees enjoy the recorded presentations, and I look forward to our discussion.
Hi, my name is Ladd Keith, and I'm an assistant professor in planning at the University of Arizona, and I'll be sharing some research on planning for extreme heat, a literature review done with Sarah Miro and Tess Wagner. So when thinking about planning in extreme heat, we know that extreme heat has impacts across urban systems, including public health infrastructure, urban ecology, economic productivity, and more. And of course, planners have a commitment to the health and safety of their communities, as well as responsibility to address climate change. Planners also are in charge of regulatory tools that play an important role in shaping land use and urban form, which in turn both impact urban heat island and climate change. And 70% of planners in the United States are worried about extreme heat, which is a disconnect because only 4% of climate adaptation resources in a 2016 survey actually focused on extreme heat. So what we wanted to do with this literature review is look at what are the current state of research on planning for extreme heat, as well as finding out the gaps in knowledge needed to advance extreme heat planning. So we did a systematic literature review and searched for papers with urban heat or extreme heat in planning and the title, abstract, or keywords, and then read and categorized those into primary focus areas and reviewed 21 papers in depth. What we found was a majority, 60% of those papers were written in the last 5 years, which is quite a rise recently. And many of those papers looked at specifically 2 areas of strategies for addressing extreme heat and planning. One was in risk management, where the focus was on managing heat as an emergency issue and not addressing heat as a chronic risk, which has a lot of equity implications. And so many of the papers discuss the need to understand and address the root causes of vulnerability in order to advance equity in heat planning. And then a number of the papers also looked at heat mitigation through the design of the built environment. And notable that the design strategies are very location specific, depending on the climate and geography of the city. And then many of these solutions were also technical and material. And so focusing on the built environment and not so much on social interventions. So when we looked at design of the built environment, there's many of the papers talked about vegetation and increasing urban forestry, green infrastructure, green roofs and walls, and parks and open space. Many of the papers also discussed buildings and urban infrastructure, so the orientation and shaping and massing, as well as updating building standards, and particularly in older cities with larger building stock, looking at weatherization of existing buildings. And for cities in temperate locations that are crossing climate thresholds, looking at the adoption of air conditioning in places that historically haven't needed it before. At a city or regional scale, there's a lot of papers looking at land use and urban form. So the urban geometry and density of cities. In cities that are dense and have tall buildings, looking at ventilation corridors to increase airflow, and then the location and size of parks and open space within cities. Also important was both man-made and natural water features, and then land conservation and the idea that protecting natural or even agricultural lands provides a cooling benefit and actually does help mitigate heat in cities. So from the design and the built environment, there was many discussion of the complexities and how all of these various strategies interact with each other, and then also the scale of strategy versus the scale of benefit. With the idea that if you have an apartment building and put reflective paint on the roof, it may cool off that building and reduce a small amount of regional urban heat island effect, but it won't increase the thermal comfort of pedestrians walking on the sidewalk nearby. There's also discussion of weighing trade-offs between heat mitigation and other goals. And you can imagine in the desert Southwest, increasing urban forestry may impact water resources, which is also scarce. So kind of weighing those community values against each other. And then finally, the danger of maladaptation for heat strategies. And particularly of concern was more widespread air conditioning and the energy potential that has to increase greenhouse gas emissions, and less energy efficiency is paired with that strategy. Additional considerations, legal structures and the lack of governance framework is needed for extreme heat planning. And then also the discussion of mainstreaming extreme heat into existing plans and processes like comprehensive plans and hazard mitigation plans and climate action plans. Appropriate use of urban heat island modeling and mapping was a discussion, as well as the limited use of climate change projections. And we found that planners were not using a lot of climate change projections as they were looking at heat, but instead looking at their past experienced heat as they went forward and planned. The need for appropriate scales of information and connecting those to strategies, as well as cost-benefit analysis for all of the heat mitigation strategies out there. And then finally, decision makers lack training for extreme heat planning, which means that many of these strategies, even as they are for the research, need to be connected to practice better. So with that, I look forward to the discussion after the panel presentation. And just to note that our full paper is available at tinyurl.com/extreme heat planning. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Sarah Miro, and today I'm going to be presenting on planning for resilience to extreme heat in US cities. This work that I'm going to give you some highlights from today was motivated by research that LAD presented on, revealing a lack of research on heat planning processes. In an effort to fill this gap, LAD and I designed an online survey which sought to better understand how planners from different cities are planning for the rising threat of heat in the US. We conducted the survey on 2 samples to provide as comprehensive as possible of an understanding of the current state of heat planning in the US. The first targeted sample is a stratified random sample of planners in cities of different sizes in terms of population and different regions, designed to provide as representative and diverse selection of communities as possible. The second, convenience sample, captures the perspectives of planning professionals more broadly, especially those that are taking an active interest in heat or climate hazards, for example, who are part of heat listservs and networks. Now, let's dig right into the results. The majority of respondents indicated that they were somewhat to very concerned about extreme heat impacts overall, as well as the economic, environmental, and health impacts specifically. Now, planners were actually more concerned about impacts to environment and public health than they were to the economic impacts of heat, and more planners were concerned about climate change as a contributor to extreme heat than they were about the urban heat island. When it comes to specific heat impacts to their communities, the big takeaway is that more than 80% of the planners said that their communities were impacted in some way by heat. The top 5 most commonly reported impacts for both samples were to energy and water use, urban vegetation, public health, and quality of life. In contrast, retail and economic development were less commonly reported impacts. Now, we asked planners what types of plans they were addressing heat in. And over 65% of both samples, so the vast majority, said that they were addressing heat in at least one of their plans, but we see quite a bit of variation in the type. So sustainability, climate, and resilience plans, which we sort of grouped together, were the most commonly reported place to address heat in. And in fact, 36% of the targeted sample and over 50% of the general sample said that they were addressing heat in these types of plans. On the other side, zoning codes and regulations were the least commonly reported place to actually include heat. And it's interesting to note that the minority of planners said that their communities were integrating heat into their hazard mitigation plans. Now, what information do planners use as they're planning for heat? Well, over 70% of the respondents in both samples said that they were using some sort of heat information. The most common were vegetation maps, heat index, and historical temperature data, whereas future scenarios were the least commonly used. We also asked planners specifically whether they weren't using heat information sources because they didn't think they would be useful or because they weren't available, with the idea that the latter would give us a sense of what some potential information gaps are that climate service providers or researchers could actually help to fill. And what we see is that planners said that the biggest gaps in terms of information were for future scenarios, land surface temperature data, air temperature data, and heat vulnerability maps. So again, these are some gaps that there is an opportunity to try and address. Now, planners unfortunately do perceive many barriers to advancing heat resilience, the most significant of those being related to human and financial resources as well as political will. And on average, we can see that at least that all of these barriers that we included in the survey were seen as at least a slight barrier, and most of them were actually seen as somewhat of a barrier on average by planners. Now, when it comes to what sort of strategies communities are using to try and address heat specifically, the good news is that around 90% of planners said they were implementing something, and over 50% of both samples said that they were implementing urban forestry and emergency response strategies, so these were the most commonly implemented, followed by weatherization and man-made shade. In contrast, very few communities said they had heat regulations or staff who were specifically dedicated to heat. So in conclusion, most planners are concerned about heat impacts to their communities, especially from climate change. The majority of planners said that their communities had already been impacted in some way by extreme heat, the most common impacts being to the energy and water use, vegetation, and health. Most planners said that their communities were addressing heat in some plan, and when addressing and planning for heat, planners use different information sources, but there is some types of information sources that planners see as not being readily available. And these are, a possible place where service providers and researchers could contribute. Many communities are implementing heat strategies, especially urban vegetation, but the bad news is that planners do see a lot of barriers to effective heat resilience planning. Now, there are lots more findings, including regional differences, possible differences or lack thereof between communities of different sizes, and also what sort of variables predict things like what strategies are implemented, but I unfortunately don't have time to go into those in this presentation, but I really look forward to the Q&A and our discussion. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Kelly Turner, and I'm a faculty member in Urban Planning and Associate Director of Urban Environment Research at the Luskin Center for Innovation at UCLA. And today I'm going to present data from a national assessment of municipal heat plans in order to answer the central question, how are cities planning for heat? In order to answer this question, we conducted a content analysis of 176 municipal planning documents from the 50 most populous U.S. cities. We collected the most recent iteration of climate sustainability resilience infrastructure general and other plans at the city scale and county and hazard plans. Two coders collected data at the clause scale on problem framing, hard and soft interventions, and we also included secondary data at the city scale on climate and social variables, including membership to environmental networks. What type of problem is urban heat? While 82% of plans mention heat, fewer were more specific about the type of problem heat poses. The most frequent framings were extreme heat, urban heat island, and health. Thermal comfort was the least common framing. Heat was only framed as equity in 27% of plans. How will urban heat be addressed? Soft interventions like programs and education were more prevalent overall than hard interventions to the built environment. Of the hard interventions, trees were by far the most frequent intervention mentioned, followed by comprehensive approaches that include multiple interventions and roof interventions. Do interventions named match the problem framing? To some extent they do. For instance, interventions like trees, reflective and green roofs that are more likely to address regional heat island were mentioned together. Although thermal comfort was rarely mentioned, shade did emerge as one of the correlated solutions. Extreme heat events correlated to soft interventions like programs and to warning systems. Hard interventions vary in effectiveness by regional climate. While the frequency of hard intervention content varied by region, the Northwest and Southwest had more heat content, while the Southeast and Northwest had relatively little. The ranking of interventions did not vary much by region, with exception of shade, which was most common in the Southwest. Somewhat problematically, cities that were most heat exposed were least likely to have plans that deployed a vulnerability framing. And there were a handful of indications of regional differences in interventions. Hot cities were more likely to mention shade, but less likely to mention permeable pavers. Wet cities were more likely to mention trees, but less likely to mention shade. Social factors were more correlated overall than climate factors to heat content, and equity framing was correlated to democratic cities with high income inequality and negatively correlated with percent white non-Hispanic population. Income inequality, as measured by the Gini factor, was the strongest correlate with multiple items. Network membership correlated to different attributes of heat content. C40 membership correlated to the presence of heat content, while the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities membership correlated to frequency of mentions in heat content. And the Urban Sustainability Directors Network correlated most strongly with equity and vulnerability content. Thank you for listening to this pre-recorded talk, and I look forward to the live discussion. I would like to thank my students and faculty collaborators on this project.